What's up, y'all? Zohran Mamdani just won the Democratic primary election for mayor of New York City, and I just want to discuss some of the potential outcomes of his policy platform if he happens to win. More specifically, I want to get into his concept of freezing rent prices and what effect that might actually have, contrary to what he's actually saying.
I'm freezing your rent as the next mayor of New York City. Let's plunge into the details. More than 2 million New Yorkers live in rent-stabilized units, and their rents are set by the Rent Guidelines Board. The board is made up of 9 members, and the mayor appoints each one. Doing this, Eric Adams' board has raised the rent every year he's been in office. Makes sense for a guy who said, "I am real estate."
Currently, 8 of Adams' 9 appointees' terms are up and could be replaced tomorrow, and that's exactly what I would do.
Rent freezes have happened before. De Blasio's board did it 3 times. I would do the same every year, only appointing those who understand that landlords are doing just fine.
Last March, the board found that landlord incomes rose by nearly twice the increase of their expenses.
The median income for a rent-stabilized household is $60,000 a year. Any rent hike could push them out of this city. For those landlords who need a little extra help, there's a city fund they can apply to. So here's to a new year, a new mayor, and the same rent.
Whew. So I just want to unpack the rhetoric here just a tad bit to say that what he's saying is rent freeze, but this is known as something called rent control. And so it's just a rhetorical touch that I think has to be addressed before we get into the consequences as such. First, in order to understand some of the problems with rent control, we have to understand the difference between scarcity and shortage. Scarcity can be understood as a natural phenomenon where there's always going to be more demand than supply. Whereas in a shortage, there's an artificial increase in demand, but the supply hasn't changed. So think about a concert ticket being capped at $5, but the number of seats haven't changed. People really want to go to this concert because it's so cheap, but the number of seats haven't changed, thus you have a shortage. Now, Mamdani is right that we've seen rent controls in the past. For example, after World War II, we actually had the same amount of housing as before the war, yet there was a huge housing shortage due to rent control. People were desperate to find places to live, even though the physical amount of housing hadn't changed. Artificially low prices also inflate the demand unnecessarily because you'll have people who won't necessarily need a place to stay, but they'll go and grab places to stay just off the simple fact that it's so cheap. So it's the same thing with the concert ticket. The amount of seats haven't changed, yet the demand is constantly going up because the price is so low. We've even seen cases where people who have plenty of resources go and grab up all of the cheap properties because they can and hoard them, use them for storage, whatever they want to do with them. Whereas like the people who actually need those homes don't have access to them because the people with the resources have grabbed them all up because they're cheap. And we've even had studies in places like San Francisco and Manhattan that showed that a single individual will occupy one home while thousands of people desperately need homes. Yet in the case of builders, if the law says that you can't charge enough to cover your expenses that it would cost for you to build and operate, then why would you build in that area? Well, you wouldn't. And this is a global phenomenon wherein in the past, when places like Melbourne, Australia actually imposed rent controls, they didn't build new houses or new apartments for 9 years. Meanwhile, stateside, we saw places like Santa Monica, California, where building permits actually dropped 90%. And then we have to ask what happens with existing landlords. Well, if they can't cover the cost of maintenance, that's one reason why a house will become run down, an apartment building will become run down. But also, they don't have to have a care in the world about it because they don't have to compete for tenants anymore. So, I mean, it's just a bad situation altogether. That's why over time, you see places like New York City with all of these buildings that are structurally sound, but inside they're inhabitable because the owners basically just gave up on them. And it's really a tragedy to see so many homeless people, but it's all of these unoccupied buildings. And why is it the case that wherever you find rent controls and housing shortages, you find a plethora of new office buildings, new commercial buildings being built? Well, it's because those are not price controlled. There's no rent control on those buildings. And here's the part that should irritate everybody. It especially irritates me. Rent control is always sold by politicians as a way to help the poor. But what we find when we actually look at empirical studies is that the rich are actually the ones who are benefiting in large part. We've seen cases in New York City where affluent investors or long term residents are paying little to nothing for luxury apartments. Meanwhile, the city is paying thousands of dollars for people to stay in lesser environments. We've even had studies that have shown that a significant portion of rent control occupants actually have high incomes. So, yeah, while it sounds good to try to help the poor, what we end up with in practice is a weird situation where the people who need help the most are still struggling, and those who don't need help are actually benefiting the most from a system built that was supposed to help the poor. And on top of all of that, it seems like a strange outcome, but cities with strict rent control in place often end up with higher rent averages. That's because the developers are forced then to build upscale stuff only, stuff that's unregulated, and that's gonna trend the market upward. And sadly, homelessness tends to be higher in places that have all of these rent controls that intend to make rent more affordable. And this is exactly why my favorite Dr. Thomas Sowell quote is not the one that everybody knows, which is there's no solutions, there's only trade offs. It's a great one too. But actually, the one where he says, just because we can't do everything doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, but we need to be sure that we have our facts straight so we don't make things worse while trying to make them better. I can acknowledge that many people on the left have great intentions, but when met with facts, we have to be careful not to anoint ourselves in such a way that does not allow us to fully examine the facts of the matter when making political decisions. It's really that simple. Thank you for listening.